Sometimes a place, um, a totally ordinary place, gets burned into your memory for just the absolute worst reasons. Today we're doing a deep dive into one of those. It's the horrific unsolved murders of 4 young girls at an, I can't believe it's, yogurt shop. Happened in Austin, Texas, way back in 1991.
Yeah, it's a case that still casts this really long shadow over Austin. Just a story of terrible loss and, decades of unanswered questions.
So try and picture it. It's Friday night, December 6, 1991, getting close to 11 o'clock, closing time at the yogurt shop. And inside, there are 4 young women, girls, really. Amy Ayers, she was only 13. Eliza Thomas, 17. Jennifer Harbison, also 17, she actually worked there.
Yeah.
And her younger sister, Sarah Harbison, who was 15.
And Sarah and Amy, they were just hanging out, right? Waiting for Jennifer to finish her shift so they could all head home together.
Exactly, just waiting for a ride.
And just moments before 11, there was a couple leaving the shop. They told police later they saw 2 men inside who seemed kind of, furtive, suspicious.
Right after that, Jennifer locked the front door. Then, maybe an hour later, around midnight, a police officer on patrol spots it. The yogurt shop is on fire.
A huge fire. And the scene the firefighters found inside, well, it was just beyond tragic.
They found the bodies of all 4 girls inside the shop after they put the fire out.
Each one had been shot in the head. And the investigation later revealed these just brutal details. At least one of the girls had been raped.
And they used 2 different guns.
That's right. A .22 and a .380 pistol. The fire, it was pretty clear, was arson, set deliberately.
Almost certainly to, destroy evidence.
Exactly. And there was another detail, the back door. It was found unlocked.
Unlocked, so maybe an entry point. Or exit?
Could be. There was even a story about maybe a guy who took ages in the restroom earlier that night, possibly jamming it open. So that was definitely a focus early on.
And the initial thinking from investigators was what?
Well, given how it seemed planned, the control over 4 victims, they leaned towards an experienced, probably adult criminal, someone who knew what they were doing.
Okay, let's dig into the specifics a bit more. The scene itself, what they found with the victims, it's grim but important.
It really is. So Sarah, Eliza, and Jennifer, they were found gagged and bound.
With their own clothes.
With their own underwear, actually. Their bodies were very badly burned, charred, and each had been shot. Execution style, really. Back of the head with .22 caliber lead bullets.
Horrific. And Amy's situation was different, you said?
Yes, Amy Ayers, the youngest one. She was found in a separate part of the shop, and unlike the others, her body wasn't as severely charred.
But still burned.
Oh, yes. Significant burns. Second and early 3rd degree, they estimated over maybe 25 to 30% of her body. And there was something else. A sock-like cloth found around her neck.
Like a ligature.
Possibly. Or maybe another form of gagging or restraint, and like the others, she'd been shot. But incredibly, one bullet, it actually missed her brain. A second one caused devastating brain injury.
God, the details are just.
Yeah.
And that cloth around her neck, different from the others.
It is. It suggests maybe something different happened with Amy, or maybe she was handled differently by the attackers. Lots of awful possibilities there.
So the investigation kicks off. Huge pressure, obviously. Lots of leads.
A ton of leads initially. Loads of persons of interest, as they call them. One that popped up early was a 15-year-old kid.
Why him?
He was found near a mall just a few days later, and he had a .22 handgun on him.
The same caliber used in the murders.
Right. But, and this is important, that specific gun was never confirmed as the murder weapon. Ballistics didn't match up, or they couldn't definitively say.
So what happened with him?
Well, he gave investigators some information, pointed fingers at some younger friends, but they eventually decided he was probably just trying to talk his way out of the gun charge. He and the kids he named were eventually clear.
Okay, so that lead dried up.
Yeah.
Then what? Years pass, right?
Years pass. The case goes cold. And then, much later, it takes this really sharp and, frankly, very controversial turn.
Awesome.
A new detective working the cold case files starts looking at 4 teenagers who were around back in '91. Guys who are now in their 20s.
And who were they?
Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. The detective developed a theory that these 4 were the ones responsible.
And this led to arrests.
It led to intense interrogations and eventually, yes, confessions from some of them, Springsteen and Scott, primarily. They implicated themselves and the other 2.
Confessions. That sounds like a breakthrough.
Well, yes and no, because here's a huge issue. Those initial interrogations, the ones back in 1991, shortly after the crime, there are no recordings, no audio, no video.
Seriously, none at all.
None that have ever surfaced, which raises massive red flags, you know?
Yeah.
You can't verify what was said, how questions were phrased, whether details of the crime, maybe details only the killer would know, were fed to them accidentally or not.
So the confessions obtained years later could have been contaminated by information police already had.
That's the major concern. Without recordings, it's impossible to rule out coercive tactics or suggestion. And yet, based almost entirely on these later uncorroborated confessions,
They got convictions.
two of them, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, were convicted, based solely on their own statements incriminating themselves and each other.
And the sentences.
They differed because of age. Michael Scott was only 15 at the time of the murders, so he received a life sentence. Springsteen was older, 17, I believe, and he was sentenced to death.
Wow. But you said the story gets more complex.
Oh, much more.
Right.
Because those convictions didn't stand, they were eventually overturned.
Why? What happened?
It came down to something called the Confrontation Clause of the Sixth Amendment. Basically, your right to confront witnesses against you.
Okay.
In their trials, the prosecution used parts of Springsteen's confession against Scott and parts of Scott's confession against Springsteen. But neither man testified at the other's trial.
Ah, so they couldn't cross-examine the source of the statement being used against them?
Exactly. The courts ruled that violated their constitutional rights, so the convictions were thrown out, and both Springsteen and Scott were released from prison in 2009.
Released after years inside.
Yes. And then came another huge development. DNA.
DNA evidence from the crime scene.
From one of the victims, yes. They managed to isolate a DNA profile from an unknown male. And here's the kicker. It did not match Robert Springsteen. It did not match Michael Scott.
Or the other two guys they confessed with? Pierce and Wellborn?
Nope. Didn't match any of them. It belonged to someone completely unidentified.
That changes everything, surely.
You'd think so. It cast enormous doubt on the confessions, obviously. Faced with this, the prosecution, well, they eventually had to drop their plans to retry Scott and Springsteen.
So they were free, but was there any compensation for the years they spent locked up?
No, that's another twist. The Texas courts denied them compensation. The reasoning was basically that they hadn't definitively proven their innocence, just that the conviction was overturned and the DNA didn't match. It's a really high bar in Texas.
That seems incredibly unjust if they didn't do it.
It highlights a real problem with wrongful conviction compensation. And it's worth noting, one of the detectives involved in getting these confessions, a guy named Hector Polanco,
Yeah.
he'd been involved in another controversial case before. Two men, Ochoa and Danziger, were convicted based on confessions he obtained, spent 13 years in prison, and were later completely exonerated by DNA.
So a pattern of potentially coercive interrogation tactics.
It certainly raises that question, doesn't it? Makes you look much harder at how those yogurt shop confessions were obtained.
And did the original jurors ever weigh in on this new DNA?
Yes, actually. 7 jurors from the original trials later said publicly that if they'd known about this unknown male DNA back then, they would not have voted to convict Scott and Springsteen.
Wow. That's powerful. So if not those 4, who else did they look at?
Well, over the years, other names came up. Kenneth McDuff, for
The
instance.
serial killer. He was active around Austin then, wasn't he?
He absolutely was. And he targeted young people, so he was definitely considered. But investigators eventually ruled him out. They didn't find evidence connecting him directly to this crime scene.
Any other serious leads?
The most astonishing thing, maybe, is the sheer number of false confessions this case generated.
False confessions. How many?
Austin police have admitted that over 50 people confessed to the yogurt shop murders at one point or another.
50. That's incredible.
It really is. Includes McDuff. Apparently, he confessed on the day he was executed for his other murders. And there were 2 Mexican nationals held in Mexico back in '92 who confessed.
But that was ruled false too.
Yeah, pretty quickly disputed and ultimately dismissed as false. It just shows the intense spotlight on this case, the pressure, maybe people seeking attention or being pressured themselves, who knows. But it muddied the waters terribly.
Okay, so let's just quickly recap the legal roller coaster for Springsteen and Scott. Springsteen's conviction overturned in '06. Supreme Court says no to putting it back.
Correct. Then in 2008, their defense teams asked for more DNA testing on other potential suspects, maybe, but nothing matched that key unknown male profile found earlier.
That unknown DNA just hangs over everything.
It really does. So June 2009, Scott and Springsteen are out on bond. Retrial still technically possible. The DA at the time, Rosemary Lemberg, she put out a statement acknowledging the DNA issue, saying they were still committed to finding the truth.
And then?
Then, in October 2009, all charges against both men were officially dismissed, dropped completely.
And Maurice Pierce, one of the other four originally accused.
Tragically, he died in 2010. He was involved in an altercation with an Austin police officer during a traffic stop, was shot and killed.
Just layer upon layer of tragedy and complication in this case.
It never seems to end, and the impact, even decades later, is still being felt, even at a legislative level.
Right, you mentioned legislation. What came out of this?
Well, in 2021, the House Judiciary Committee passed a bipartisan bill. It was really pushed by Representative Michael McCaul, whose district includes Austin.
And what did it aim to do?
It was designed to give families of cold case victims a way to formally ask the federal government to re-examine unsolved cases, specifically those older than 3 years.
Sort of a mechanism to force a fresh look with new eyes or tech.
That seems to be the idea. And then in 2022, there was some buzz, an announcement that new, more advanced DNA tech was giving investigators fresh hope, bringing them closer potentially to identifying that unknown male profile.
Still no definitive answer, though.
Not that's been made public, but perhaps the biggest legislative impact, the most direct line from this case, is a federal law.
Which one?
It's called the Homicide Victims' Families' Rights Act. President Biden signed it into law in August 2022.
And it was directly inspired by the yogurt shop case.
Explicitly. It came about because of the family's long, frustrating fight for answers. The law is meant to ensure federal law enforcement agencies review cold cases using the latest forensic technology and investigation standards.
Does it guarantee a review if families ask?
It sets up a process for families to request a federal review. Now, the exact logistics, how it works in practice, are maybe still a bit undefined in the text of the bill itself, but the intent is clear. Give families more leverage to get these older cases looked at again with everything we know now.
That's a significant legacy, born from such awful circumstances.
Absolutely. But for the families of Amy, Eliza, Jennifer, and Sarah, and for Austin, it remains this deeply painful, unresolved wound. A cold case in the truest sense. The search for who did this and why, it continues.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the things that really stand out are, first, just the absolute horror of the crime. 4 young lives ended so brutally. The enduring mystery.
Definitely. And then the investigation itself. So flawed, so complex, the questionable confessions, the years people spent imprisoned.
Right, and then the power of DNA, how it eventually just blew apart the case against Scott and Springsteen, even if it didn't identify the killer.
Exactly. And maybe the most lasting thing is that lack of closure. Decades later, the families still don't have definitive answers. And that pain, that frustration, has now literally changed federal law regarding cold cases.
It really makes you think. Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listeners. Consider this. We have seen incredible leaps in forensic tech since 1991. Things like genetic genealogy are solving cases that seemed impossible before. So, thinking about this case, the yogurt shop murders, with its troubled history, the contested investigation, the potential miscarriage of justice, what are the bigger implications, ethical and practical, of going back into these cold cases, especially the really messy ones?
Where new science might finally bring the truth to light, but could also reopen old wounds or uncover uncomfortable truths about past investigations?
Exactly. What's the right balance? It's something that hangs in the air long after you hear the details of what happened that awful night in Austin.